Hello BookTube, I am back and today I want to talk to you about the Odyssey by Homer. There's of course Steve Donahue who's been hosting his Odyssey read-along and I've kind of been following along in the sense that I read through this book, although in about the space of a week, as I had holidays, so I had time to devote to reading. And unfortunately it didn't really work out to make a weekly video, so instead I'm just going to talk about all 24 books of the Odyssey in one go in this video. So before starting, a brief word on this translations. This is the new translation by Emily Wilson. It came out quite recently, this year, early this year or somewhere last year. The paperback's coming out in November and I really enjoy this translation. So, apart from the text itself, you get 100 or so odd pages of introduction, covering kind of the context, what we know about Homer, whether Homer even existed in the first place, whether it was one person or multiple people, get a whole discussion of that, and a bit about the background of what Greek civilization was like at the time that the Odyssey was composed, insofar as we are certain about when the Odyssey was actually composed. We also get quite an extensive translator's note where Wilson explains her choices and her kind of philosophy and goals in creating the translation. And a nice addition, we get these nice hand-drawn maps, and we get a number of maps. So this one is kind of the mythological landscape that Odysseus travels through in the plot, and then we get a number of maps with kind of the actual geography as we know it from archaeology of the regions that Odysseus possibly travelled through, or at least where that were known to the people that composed the Odyssey, and the societies that are featured in it. So, the translation, Wilson's gone for a verse translation, so it's written entirely in iambic pentameter and in modern English. She purposely decided to render it using modern language, not archaic language, because it's a 3,500-year-old text, and just making it incomprehensible by using 100-year-old English words just doesn't really add much. And I think she really succeeded in her choice. So what is lost in the way that she translated is kind of the feeling of the Greek. So I, in senior school, read the Greek myself during some classes. I had ancient Greek classes. I've translated some of Homer myself, though, just to prose and not to any kind of standard that would be worthy publishing. But you kind of do see, if you kind of make a direct translation, like you can translate into, in my case it was into Dutch, but you could translate into English, preserving the feel of the Greek in terms of kind of sentence structures and kind of idioms, the way they are rendered. And Emily Wilson has decided to abandon that in favour of making something which really flows and has a nice rhythm, iambic pentametric rhythm in the English. And I think that choice worked out really well, so it's really a delight to read the text. It does have kind of this rhythm of its own, and it's worth losing kind of maybe the feel of the Greek, because it's a translation anyway, of a very old language that we probably even, we think of the ancient Greeks like Plato, Aristotle, that age of kind of Athens, that's also several centuries after the Odyssey was composed, so even then it would already have felt strange. So I think abandoning some of that feeling in favour of just having something which really reads nicely in English to contemporaneous reader now, I think is a good choice. And what is really important and worked out really well is that although Wilson have put modern words, present day English words, into the characters, into the mouths of the characters, she has not made them into modern day characters. Right? So although Odysseus in this version speaks to us in present day English, he is someone from 3,500 years ago with a mindset from 3,500 years ago. And so that worked really well. So throughout, Wilson does explain that was one of her goals, but throughout the story you kind of do feel kind of this slight sense of oddness, and that you're reading about people that are not from our own culture. And you see that, for example, in Odysseus is a king, but you do kind of see clearly that the word king to the people in the story doesn't mean kind of the same thing it does to us, right? There are no crowns and courts and subjects and authoritarian kings giving out decrees, right? The king seems to be just the person who happens to have the largest estate, so if there's a war, then he gets to be in charge, but he's not ruling a kingdom. It's clear, there's a lot of talk of slaves in this book, and Wilson purposely doesn't shy away from calling them slaves. Like in a lot of translations, they might be called handmaidens or servants, but no, they are slaves. So Wilson calls them such. But it's also clear that our modern day image of slavery, especially I think if you're in the West, you get this image of American slavery, right? The slavery that took place on the cotton plantations in the south of the US. But it's also clear that the slavery described in the Odyssey is not the same type of slavery. It's not necessary to say that one was okay, or it's I don't want to compare them, but it's in sense of which one was worse. But it's clear that the image we have when we hear slave is not quite the same as the image that will be conveyed, that Homer would have had, and I think that comes across in the story as well, very well. So now moving on to the story itself, it's quite surprising how little of Odysseus' journey, how little of space in the story that takes up. So of course, because that's the famous part of the Odyssey. We think of the Odyssey of the story about Odysseus having all kinds of adventures, trying to get home, but it's really much different. It's part of it, but it seems to be more about kind of dealing with the aftermath of the Trojan War and returning to normal life after having been away at war for such a long time. So of course we open with the story of Telemachus, and it seems at first a bit of a pointless story, right? Telemachus is being sent away by Athena to hear news of his father, even though Athena knows exactly what's going on with his father and could have just told him. But no, she sends him out, he goes on the story, he doesn't actually find out much that wasn't already known. So it kind of is, what's the point of that story? But I think it's the reason Telemachus has to go out on this journey is because he needs to become someone who's going to be worthy of taking over from his father when his father kind of has to retire. So it's about the new generation and how they need to prepare to take over from the older generation. And Steve Donahue makes the point that the newer generation can't compare. Like Telemachus, is just a shade of his father. But I think that's because Telemachus is still young. It's not saying that there's no hope for Telemachus. It's just he still needs to grow and to grow into that role, and the potential is there. And so the journey he goes on is Telemachus going out and building kind of his own network of guest friends and political allies that he will be able to rely on when it is up to him to wield the political power. And that is the point of the journey, making friends with Menelaus and with Nestor's son. And that's why he has to go out on this journey, even though he doesn't find out anything about Odysseus. Then we get the section about where Odysseus ends up in the land of the Phaeacians, and then tells all his stories about what his travels and what occurred to him on his travels. And I think the interesting point about that is, from Hugh's point of view, the travels are narrated, right? So the Odyssey has a omniscient narrator who's telling the story to us. But the story of Odysseus' travels, especially so some of it, his sojourn in the island of Calypso, that is told by the narrator, but most of his travels are told by Odysseus himself. And we are shown multiple times, in fact continuously, whenever Odysseus meets a new person, he lies, right? Everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. He never tells his true name, he never tells where he was really from. Okay, maybe at some point we'll reveal his true identity, but in principle he lies. And the text doesn't flag that as a lie explicitly, right? It doesn't say Odysseus lied about his name. It just says crafty Odysseus said he was named blah 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 and he was from Crete, right? So we as reader or as hearer, because of course it was an oral tradition, we know Odysseus is lying because we know it's actually Odysseus, and we hear that the words coming out of his mouth don't match what we know about him. But the text doesn't explicitly state that, right? It's left up to us to realize that this thing Odysseus is saying is a lie. And so it's interesting that it is Odysseus who tells us the tale of his travels. We know he lies a lot, and the text itself isn't corroborating or denying the truth of what he's saying. So how much of what Odysseus said happened during his travels actually did happen? And is he, when he says, oh, it wasn't any of my fault, the bad stuff that happened with the cattle because, I was asleep somewhere else, is that true? We don't know. We have to take Odysseus' word for it. And we know Odysseus' word is perhaps not the most reliable. Right, and then finally we get the whole homecoming scene where Odysseus has to come in disguise because he's at risk of being killed by these shooters. And again, this whole shooter business is interesting because it's kind of implied that because we kind of think of why do the suitors want to marry Penelope? Well, so that they can become a king and inherit all of Odysseus' wealth. But if you read carefully, that idea also doesn't quite seem to hold up, right? So if the suitor marries Penelope, she will take her dowry with her to the new suitor, her new family, but it appears that the rest of Odysseus' possessions will actually pass to Telemachus, and also the kingship will not automatically go to whatever suitor manages to marry Penelope. Also, even if it did, kingship itself seems to bring very little benefits, right? So Odysseus' wealth is based on his own personal estates and not on tax revenue, where we think, a king gets taxes and funds all his business from that. But no, Odysseus has his own estates, he farms himself, he knows how to plow, so he actually seems he does physical labor, and he has some slaves that manage, so he has extensive herds and a kind of a hierarchy and many servants, so he has a large farm, but his income derives from his farming and maybe some trading related to that, rather than from getting tax from his subjects, even though he's king. So the suitors, maybe it's so the case that, if the suitor marries Penelope, they'll get prestige from that, and Penelope's dowry will make them rich, and therefore they'll be in a position to claim the title of king. But it's not in the sense of a hereditary kingship which is passing to them because they have married Penelope. It's again a kind of interesting contrast with how we imagine kingship these days. And then we get the final homecoming of Odysseus, and so this is not an original thought by me. I'm getting a lot of this from the Literature and History podcast. I'll link that down below. But we really see kind of the struggle of Odysseus trying to fit back into civilian society, as you would call it now, right? He's been at war so long, he can't leave those habits behind, right? He can't stop lying, even when he goes to visit his father. He has to lie almost pathologically about who he is and not reveal his true identity to his father. And when there's conflict with the families of the suitors, whom he has all murdered, who are ostensibly his subjects, if he is king of Ithaca, his only solution is to murder more people. And the only way that this spiral of violence can be broken is through a Deus Ex Machina. A literal god who appears and says, all of you, stop it right now. And you can kind of feel that, that isn't going to be a real long-term solution. Right? Okay, they've stopped killing each other because Athena said, stop killing each other. And then the story ends. But there's no resolution. Right? The suitors' families aren't suddenly okay with Odysseus having killed all their sons or brothers or whatever, because Athena said, stop fighting. Right? So it's just kind of a very unsatisfying ending in that sense. And I mean, perhaps also a realistic sense, because it's probably something we still haven't really solved even 3,500 years later. Like, how do you end the conflict? If there's been an armed conflict, if people have been killed, how do you make peace afterwards? And in that sense, I think the Odyssey really ties in to the themes of the Iliad, where it's also, in the Iliad you have this feeling that these people are at war kind of because forces beyond their control made this war happen, and now they're kind of stuck because of their role in society and what is expected of them. They're stuck into being at war, and even though they don't want to be. And Odyssey now, Odysseus comes home, but how can he escape this kind of pattern of violence that he's being trapped in because of how the world at large works? And yeah, it's kind of disquieting to think that we still maybe don't have a good answer to that. But yeah, all in all, I really, really enjoyed the book. The story. I really, really enjoyed this translation of the story. So highly recommended if you're still looking for a nice Odyssey translation to read. In November, the paperback will be coming out, so it's a cheaper option. And yeah, if you didn't like the Iliad and found it tough to go through, I think I can see why people prefer the Odyssey. I think I prefer it too, but there's more focus on specific characters. There's more character development, more insight into characters. There's less endless narration of people who were there, because it's important for kind of prestige of local towns to be named as being there. And more kind of psychological exploration and more connecting with some human characters. So if you haven't given it a read, highly, highly recommend it. And if you have been reading in the Troy along, or the Odyssey along, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you have any thoughts to add, please do leave them down below. And I will see all of you again soon. Bye bye.